Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so our client is a coffin maker in the Eastern European country of Moldovia, whatever. He has seen substantial change in his market in recent years and is contemplating the future of his business. Up until now, he has been in the business of building high-quality handcrafted coffins, largely by hand with a skilled labor force. Recently, however, he has become aware of a technology that would allow him to build machine-made coffins with much less labor. Should he invest in this new technology, and should he even remain in the coffin business in the first place?
Okay, perfect. Let me just finish writing down a couple notes I had. So, just to recap, just make sure I understand exactly what the situation is. Our client has come to us because of this change in the coffin market. I can't imagine that's a very typical problem that you guys have.
Sure.
But so there's this big change in Moldovia with old coffins being made, handcrafted. I think you mentioned lots of labor, and the new coffins are high tech. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the question specifically for McKinsey is, one, he wants to know if he should stay in the coffin business, and then two, if he should he invest in the technology?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
That's great.
Are there any preferences that he has, any way he's leaning, or is it kind of a blank slate, just go wherever?
Yeah, just kind of whatever is more valuable. There's not any emotional ties.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'd love to take a second to jot down my thoughts about what his options are, specifically about these two prompts. If you might take a second to jot that down. Great.
Sounds great.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm taking a second to jot down kind of the direction I want to go in order to answer his specific questions. I've separated them into two basic categories. Following the question itself, should he stay in the business or should he leave the business, basically? If he stays in the business, I see him having three options. First, he could do nothing. Just keep on going with these handcrafted coffins if that's what people want. I'd like to evaluate that option by basically asking myself, how are his sales going to be in the future, especially after this new technology enters the market, and so in the near future and then in the long future.
Sure.
That's how I evaluate it. Second, I want to look at his option of staying in the business but changing something about what he does. So in this case, this new technology. How is that going to affect the sales? How is that going to affect especially the quality? And how is the competition going to respond to that?
Sure.
And third, I'd like to look into maybe some other options he has. Maybe there's a hybrid between the two that he can blend. Maybe there are other options he could make specifically to his existing handcrafted model that he could change to still keep up with the competition. So those are, I feel like, his options if he stays in the coffin business.
Okay.
Then he has the other option of leaving the business.
Okay.
And within that option, I feel like there are two more specific options. First, you could just sell the company. And by that I mean you could strip it down and sell it for assets. It sounds like most of it is labor, but there may be some assets he could strip it down and sell, or he could sell the company itself as an entity, right? And he has several options within that we could dive into.
Sure.
And finally, I feel like he has the option that maybe there's a way that he could get out of the coffin business, but doesn't necessarily have to sell his company. He could take advantage of some of the assets he has, leverage them into a new business. For example, maybe there's a big demand for handcrafted furniture, handcrafted toys. I'm not really sure what Moldovia has a need for, but maybe there is a separate market where you can still leave the coffin business but enter a new segment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that. That sounds very good.
If I had to choose where I would start, I'd probably look at his options within staying in the business, specifically the difference between doing nothing and changing. Where do you think we should go?
Sure. Well, so we've considered some strategic alternatives here. So why don't we first figure out maybe what the current value of the business is and kind of start there.
Great, current value of the business, and that's, I'm assuming that means before he's made any changes in terms of new technology.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Let's do that.
great. Let me just take 10 seconds to write down how I would go about doing that. So I think there's a few different ways you could go about doing that. I'm in a finance class right now, so every time I hear anything about valuation, I immediately think, what's the discount rate?
Sure,
what's my,
net present value.
But yeah, exactly. What's my net present value? So that was my first initial thought, was to maybe look at his profitability and check that out on the discount rate. Do we have his profitability, or is that something you want us to calculate?
Let me see here. I kind of want us to calculate this a bit, like organically. So how would you kind of go about that?
Perfect. So the way I would go about calculating profitability is first look at his revenues, size of the market, and then estimate his costs. So with his, I want to start with revenues. That may be, I feel like it's the biggest thing to tackle right now.
Sure.
So with revenues, what I would want to do is, again, I'm assuming there aren't specific numbers. I'm assuming we're going to have to kind of work through this step by step.
Yeah, good assumption.
But I'm going to look at maybe figuring out what the total size of the market is in general.
Okay.
And then figure out what his percentage is.
Okay.
So get his market share out of this entire, maybe Eastern European, maybe just Moldovan coffin market.
Yeah.
And then figure out the price. But before I jump into price, I wanted to know, is there one specific price, or are there multiple different coffins that he sells?
No, coffin's a coffin. So
Okay,
there's just
perfect.
one specific price for it.
Okay,
So,
that sounds perfect. One size fits all.
Yeah.
Okay, so when sizing the market, there's a couple ways I think we could go about doing that. It'd be very easy if we just had the number of people purchasing coffins every year, but I'm going to assume that it might be more realistic to look at the number of deaths every year in Moldova. Is Moldova or Moldovia?
I think it's Moldovia.
Moldovia,
Yeah, let's do that.
haven't ever been there, so don't have any
Let's stick with
idea.
that.
So look at the number of deaths in Moldovia,
Yeah.
and then figure out how many people who die every year actually purchase a coffin. I know in the United States you have the option, obviously, of being cremated. I'm not sure that's an option in Moldovia, but if it is, I'd want to look at that number.
Okay.
I want to really quick, maybe take 2 seconds to write out an equation, figure out all the pieces I would need to figure out that final number that I was saying, the market share.
Okay, great,
Okay.
great.
Okay, so in thinking about that question, I've identified 3 major numbers that I would like to see if we have. So
Okay.
the total population of Moldovia, the death rate in that country,
Okay.
and the number of coffins. And those are numbers that I could take a stab at, but I'm not sure if you have any data to give me on those.
Okay, no, that's great. So let's deal with this a little bit here. So the first thing you said you needed was the population of Moldovia. I mean, what would you guess it to be?
So my thoughts, Eastern European country, relatively small. I can't imagine it's more than 10 million. What I would probably do to estimate that is look at, I'm assuming it's, that's a great question. I really have no idea. I would say it's something under 10 million.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah. Just want to try to calibrate that.
No,
But
that's
let's just
perfect.
go with 4 million.
Perfect, 4 million.
Okay, great. What were the other?
I wanted to take that total population, multiply it by the death rate to figure out how many deaths in the country there were in the country every year, and then multiply that by the percentage of people who use coffins.
Sure.
To get basically the total market, the number of coffin deaths. Every year,
Okay,
basically.
well, I'll give it to you in this way. So let's just assume that the average life expectancy is 75 years, and let's assume that the distribution is flat, meaning the same number of people at every age.
Okay,
So from that
perfect.
you can get the death rate. And then in terms of burial customs, let's say that 75% are buried in coffins as opposed to cremation.
Perfect. Okay. So I would take that 4 million people in Moldova. I'm going to calculate really quick the death rate, multiply it by 75%, and we should have our total market. So if you don't mind, take a second.
Sure.
I think to calculate death rate from population using life expectancy, I'm pretty sure I just divide the 4 million by the 75 years, basically saying that an equal number of people die every year.
Yep.
So 4 million divided by 75. 5 times. It's going to be a little over. It's going to be a little over 50,000. So I can calculate that number specifically, but using that 75% right there, I know it's going to be right around 40,000 people total using coffins every year.
Sounds great.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So we have about 40,000 people using coffins. And then I'd love to take a look at our market share as a percentage of that 40,000. I'm not sure that there's going to be a ton of competition in that market, but is that a number we have, or should we go about trying to estimate that?
Yeah. And really quickly, before we do that, I like where you're going with this, but we've made one assumption here, let's see, on the coffins. So what are we assuming about the population growth in Moldova?
Right. That's a great point. I need to figure out how that number will change in the future.
Okay, so that's just a subtlety I wanted to bring up. Let's assume that the population growth is flat.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
So your next question was market share. So Maldovian Coffins has 10% market share of the market.
Okay, so as I understand that means we just sell 4,000 coffins every year. And then you mentioned there was one flat price.
Yep.
So what is that price?
It's $5,000 for a coffin.
Okay, so that means we're selling 4,000 coffins at $5,000 per coffin. So that's going to get us $20 million in revenue every year. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
Okay, perfect. Now I'm going to take a second to let's start looking at these costs now. So if our revenues are 20 million, we're going to have to look at our costs. I'm going to look at our fixed costs and our variable costs, and that should give us our total profitability.
Yes.
So my imagination tells me that in a coffin business, your fixed costs, especially in this case where it's all handcrafted, are going to be relatively low. Probably just the cost of having the building itself.
Sure.
Especially if they haven't paid that off. And the variable cost, I'm assuming, is labor and materials.
Yeah.
There may be some other overhead costs that we may need to take into account as well.
Yeah.
Do we have numbers on any of those?
Yeah, so let's say that materials count for 10% of direct costs while labor accounts for the other 90%. Total cost of goods sold is $4,800 per coffin.
That's total. That's the variable cost.
Yeah. So that's the cost of goods sold. All of the variable costs, 10% of that 4,800 is labor and 10% is materials. The other is labor, kind of as you assume.
Okay.
For fixed costs, like you were asking, is $700,000 per year.
700,000 per year.
Yeah, and so let's just assume that all assets are fully depreciated and ignore taxes.
Oh, perfect. That sounds great. So, just really quick running through this, it looks like fixed costs are 700,000. Variable costs, we're going to need to multiply our 4,800 times 5,000. It may be easier just to multiply, if we're looking for profit, just to multiply 200, which is our margin, $200 between the $5,000 price and the $4,800 variable cost. Maybe use it just to multiply that by 5,000. I'm going to do that really quick.
Sounds good.
Equals 200 times 5,000 minus the variable cost, which is 700. The fixed cost is 700,000, and that gives us 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That gives us 1 million minus 700,000. I believe that gives us $300,000 total.
Okay.
Let me make sure that I did that correctly. 2 times 5, 10, and 6, 5 zeros. Yeah, I believe that should be right.
That sounds right.
Okay, perfect. I don't know why I was so unsure about that. Okay, so we have a annual profit of $300,000.
Okay, yeah.
And then, like I was mentioning earlier, to kind of figure out the net present value of that profit, I would want to divide by a discount rate.
Sure. So let's just assume a discount rate of 10%.
10%. Okay. Uh, 10%. So that give us just $3 million.
Yep.
Okay. So the valuation of that company is, if we do nothing, we can make a rough estimation that our valuation is $3 million.
Sure.
There's a couple things I would want to maybe dive deeper into before I give that number to our client, specifically the population growth, changes in the market share, and maybe changes in our discount rate.
Okay.
Those would be the numbers I would want to look at specifically, but using the information we have here, I'm fairly confident in that $3 million number.
Okay, that sounds great. So now let's look at what the value of the company is if it were to shut down and the assets were sold.
Okay, if we just strip it down, sell the assets.
Yeah.
Okay, well we mentioned before we clearly have some assets because we have a fixed cost.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like a lot of what we do, a lot of our operation is made up of this labor.
Yeah.
This high, and I'm assuming we probably can't sell away our labor.
Yeah.
No
No slavery in Moldova.
So I'm going to assume that we have relatively few assets. We may have some machinery. We may have property and equipment. Property and the building itself. And we may have patents or other intellectual property.
Yeah.
Do we have any information on that?
Yeah, so let's just assume that the assets, since they're building coffins by hand, like you said, the fixed assets, they're just essentially land and improvements.
Okay.
Let's just consider that. So these are owned outright by the company.
Okay. We own them 100%.
Own them 100%, yep.
Okay, I know you mentioned that a little earlier as well. Okay, perfect. So we're just going to try to find the estimate of the value on that land and on those improvements, right?
Yeah, and so let's assume, first of all, because we will get into numbers a little bit, but let's just assume you're a McKinsey consultant right now. How would you go about finding, give me a few ways for how we could find the value of that.
Okay, well, right off the bat, I can think of two ways I would separate it. Would be calculating it, basically taking the initial price we purchased it at, the initial value the land had, and finding a way to value those improvements as well at the point that we first purchased them, and then space them out over a long period of time. So however long we've owned them, kind of figure out the interest that's accumulated, the value that's appreciated, however you want to go about calculating that, but essentially just using our own little world, not looking at anything else around us.
Okay.
And the other way I would go about looking at it is maybe evaluating it based on the current situation. So there's basically two subsets within that. One would be looking at comparable properties.
Okay, that makes
so
sense.
maybe there's a toy manufacturer right next door to us.
Sure.
Same size land. What we could do is we figure out the value that his property has at a per square foot basis, something like that. So evaluate it based on comparable. Or what we could do is we could evaluate it based on future value of the company, right?
Sure.
So maybe we rented out the land, maybe we could find another purpose for it, and then again discount those cash flows.
Okay.
So I think those would be the three ways I would go: calculated, comparable, and future cash flows.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Let's go the calculated route.
Okay, perfect.
I'm going to give you some data here, and you can massage it a little bit. So the book value of the land is $2,000.
2,000?
Or I'm sorry, $200,000.
That's cheap land.
Yeah, Moldova's a good place to go. The book value of improvements is $80,000. The years that it's been owned is 48 years, and the average real estate appreciation is 6% per year.
Okay. So I just have a quick clarifying question. So I'm assuming land appreciates at 6% per year, but would improvements appreciate as well? I'm not really a real estate guru, so I'm not sure. My thought would be that they would stay relatively static, or maybe even depreciate in value, but I'm not sure. Do we have any information on that?
That's a great question. Let's just say that it stays static.
Okay, so we have a total of $280,000 essentially. That's the value, our book value of our company.
Yeah.
Basically, or book value of our assets, basically the value at which we bought them 48 years ago, right?
Sure, yeah.
And every year it's appreciated 6%. So what I could do is I could go about doing this, and every year add another 6%. But I know there's a trick where you divide, I want to say 72 by the percentage. Move 72.
Yeah.
I could be totally making that up. Does that sound right?
That's
to you?
right. So if you take 72, divide 6 as a percent, what does that tell you?
That will give me, I believe, the number. the number of times it doubles within, or the number of years it takes to double in value.
That's exactly
Okay.
it. Yep.
Okay, so 72 divided by 6, that give us 12. So essentially it takes 12 years for it to double. So in 48 years it should have doubled 4 times. So
That makes sense.
280 after our first 12-year period,
Mm-hmm.
it would double to 560. After our second 12-year period, so we're at year 24, it would double to 1,100,020. Is that correct? Yes,
Yeah.
$1,100,020. After our third 12-year period, we're talking about now year 36. Just want to make sure I keep those numbers straight in my head.
Sounds good.
It would double to, let's see, $2,200,040. And then after our fourth period, it would double again to $4,480,000. So we may just want to call that 4.5 million.
Okay.
Does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds fair.
Okay, so 4.5 million is essentially the value of the land, of our total assets right now, if we were to strip them down and sell that. So looking at that number, my first impression is to compare it to the value if we stayed in business, and obviously that's significantly high. But before I made any recommendations, I would want to look at maybe some of the assumptions that we're using. This 6% per year, that may be a little high, and more than anything I'd want to know is what we value at, this 4.5 million, is that what the market reflects as well? Can we actually sell it for 4.5 million?
Sure,
Does that make
sure.
sense?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's probably where we could bring in like what you were talking about before and compare it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's,
okay.
yeah, perfect.
No, I think that's good. Okay.
But just with the numbers we have right now, before we moved on,
Mhm.
I would say I would be leaning right now towards stripping down the company and selling its assets.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, let's move on to another analysis here.
Perfect.
So now let's look at what would the value of the company be if it invests in new technology.
Okay. So the new technology, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just take a second really quick to think about how that would change our current situation.
Sure.
Okay, so just my initial thoughts are trying to figure out how it affects both our revenue and our costs, because our real question is just how is this going to affect our profitability, right?
Sure.
So in terms of quantity, within the actual revenue, in terms of quantity sold, I'd want to look at how it affects our quality of our product.
Okay.
I'm not really sure why customers purchase our coffins over others, but we want to make sure that if there's a specific type of coffin or specific quality of the coffin they're looking for, especially because we seem like we're selling these handcrafted, they must be higher end coffins, that's going to be a major concern for us. How will a machine-made coffin affect the quality and therefore the quantity of the items that we're selling?
Sure.
And by that same means, does that mean we have to change our price in order to maybe to play with that quantity? Or maybe this has a positive effect on the quality and we can even increase our price.
Sure.
So those would be things I would want to look into. How does it affect the quality? I think that's the core problem there.
Okay.
And long term, how that affects our competition. If we've made this move, is that going to change our market share? Which again will change our quantity.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So we want to talk a little bit about kind of the qualitative aspects of this investment. It's sounding like, well, let me tell you a few things. So you talked a little bit about customers and their preferences. You talked a little bit about competition. So let's talk about this a little bit. So in terms of the competitive nature of this, it is not yet known whether the competitors have acquired this same type of technology or planning to acquire this technology. So that's kind of all we know for now.
Okay.
In terms of customer preferences, though, while the machine-made coffins are not handmade, the quality perceived by the customer is the same or better.
Oh, perfect.
So it is believed that the customer will be indifferent between the quality and appearance of a handmade and a machine-made coffin. So
the result is complete indifference.
yeah, complete indifference. So you talked a little bit about like brand. I can tell you this, well, actually, let me read this for a second. So we may think that it might negatively impact our brand, but let's just assume that since there's not going to be too much of a difference, it's not.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, people don't care what brand their grandpa's buried in. So.
Perfect. So the revenues then the way I would estimate that is figure out then it looks like they're going to remain relatively constant if we've said that the customers have an indifference towards it. Looks like in terms of revenues, we're going to be selling similar number of coffins at relatively stable price.
Sure.
So then the big question would be how it affects costs.
Sure.
So my initial thought would be variable costs would drop significantly. We can chop out a significant portion of that 90% of the variable cost. And then I'm assuming we would have an increase in those $700,000 fixed costs.
Yeah. So let's say that the material costs will remain the same, but like you were saying, the labor costs are going to be reduced. So that's the part of the variable cost. It's going to reduce by 50%. And then on the fixed cost side, investing in this new technology will cost the firm $1 million.
Okay. So when you say investing, does that mean we purchase these new machines and then after that it's nothing, or is it $1 million every year?
Is it $1 million every year? Okay, yeah, $1 million every year.
Oh, okay, perfect. So our fixed cost is going to have an additional $1 million every year.
There you go.
Okay, gotcha. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So if I take a step back and look at our revenues, I believe our revenues are 20 million, so that number stays the same.
Yeah.
And then our costs, we have materials costs, which is 10% of our 4,800 from the previous one, and
Yes.
we mentioned that stays the same, so that's $480 per coffin times those 4,000 coffins. And then our labor cost is reduced by 50%. Does that mean 50 percentage points? So the number I had before was 90%
Yes.
of 480.
Yes.
So now it's down to 40% of that previous number, 480, or is it we just cutting that in half?
So basically, what you can do is find out what the 90% is of the labor cost, and then reduce that by 50%. I think that's what you were asking.
Okay.
So.
So it looks like labor is $4,320 per coffin, essentially, right?
Yep.
So we're just splitting that in half. So I want to bring that number over here so I don't get confused. So our labor is going to be $320 divided by 2 times the total number of coffins we're selling every year.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then our fixed cost is going to be this $700,000 from before plus $1 million in additional costs every year from these new machines. Now, just to clarify one last time, are there any additional costs that may come about by having these machines? For example, inputs into the machine, like I don't know, maybe they run on significantly more electricity than we needed, or gas, or maintenance, anything like that, or is that all incorporated in this $1 million?
Yeah, that's a great point you bring up. Let's just assume it's all incorporated in there.
Perfect. So then we have no additional costs, and I'm just going to calculate really quick what our margins are. Again, I'm going to assume we're ignoring interest and taxes and all that.
Yeah,
all those
sounds great.
fun terms. Okay, just let me take a second to really quick calculate this out. What I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to calculate the margin and then multiply that by 4,000. I think that'd be a little easier.
Yeah.
So we have our margin is 5,000 minus 4,320 divided by 2. That is going to be, let's see, 2,160.
That's exactly right.
Perfect. Plus our 480 is going to give us, let's see, carry the 1. It's going to give us $2,640 of variable cost every year. Is that correct? Okay. So $5,000 minus 2,640 should give us our margin, which is going to be $3,360 per coffin is what we're making. That's
I
not
think that's
2,000. Yep,
there you go.
$2,360 per coffin. Well, it's pretty dang good margins we're making with this new product.
Sure.
So I'd want to multiply that by times 4,000 coffins. No, that's going to be wrong.
Well, you just kind of ballpark it.
So ballpark is going to be a little under 10. Let's see, 4 times 2.5, 10, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zeros. So $10 million, roughly $10 million. Wow.
That's great.
That's quite a bit more than our previous annual margin, which is $300,000. So to use this number, 10 million, and to compare it, what I would need to do is two things. First, again, divide it by our discount rate, assuming this is a perpetuity. And then two, kind of figure out how stable those assumptions are about the long-term growth of this $10 million number. Is that going to be a number we can maintain year after year after year, or our competitors going to see that crazy margin that we're making and kind of jump on that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So let's just say, just for analysis' sake, that the competitors would jump on this, and let's not go into numbers here, but just talk to me like qualitatively what you think would happen to that number if that were the case, that competitors jumped in on the same thing.
So the idea of competitors making a move on that kind of has two big aspects. One is how much of this new technology can be patented, can be maybe restricted with intellectual property rights. How much of that can be contained, essentially, prevent competition from doing that quickly. If it can't be, my thought would be competition would very quickly respond, and our margins would probably drop to similar levels that they were before.
Sure.
So previously we were at I believe $200 margin. My assumption is that over the long run, maybe not within the next couple of years, it may take them a while to respond, but certainly over the long run, our margins are going to drop to that same number.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, because like we were talking about, this is a pretty commodity type business, and so, yeah. So
my big concern with that is that if we've got this huge new increase in fixed cost, that means over the long run, it's going to significantly hurt our business. If we have the same, relatively similar margins, but a significantly increased fixed cost, that's going to have a huge negative impact on our bottom line.
Okay, yeah, you're right. And so for the sake of time, let's not go into a number analysis there, but I think you're understanding it pretty well. So let's say that, the Maldovian CEO walks in, and, the Moldovan people are not very patient people, and he's got to get running somewhere. So he just wants to know, based on what you know right now, what he should do.
Okay, perfect. So our initial thought, after evaluating your options, Mr. Maldovian CEO, is that the most attractive option appears to be stripping the company and selling its assets.
Sure.
What we've looked at so far is we've looked at the option of keeping the company at its current state without investing in this new technology, and the present value we've estimated with that is roughly $3 million. There's a few things we need to check in with that. We've also looked at acquiring this new technology, and our thoughts are that at first it appears very attractive. We're going to have amazing returns, but the thought is that over the long run, our competition is going to respond and our margins are going to drop, making that also not as attractive as stripping down and selling the assets.
Sure.
The total value we have for that option of stripping down the company is almost $5 million. It's about $4.5 million, which is significantly more than either of those other two options. If I had a little more time to evaluate your situation, I'd also want to look at comparable values of selling the company as a whole. We could look at things like selling the company, selling off equity in the company. We could look at selling it, as I was saying, as an entity in and of itself, and that's where I want to go next.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you for your time.
All right, perfect.